Join us on an investigative journey as we educate each other on a scientific discovery, concept, or phenomenon.
Then we'll take a dive into the complex and misleading world of pseudoscience to sort the factual from the fabricated.
I'm Matt McCabe.
And I'm Levi Bateman.
And this is IdioFacto. First episode back. Welcome back.
Thank you. And likewise.
Thank you.
Well, we've sort of eased back into it with a little bonus intro, prelude, whatever you want to call it, prologue.
Yeah, but this is the first real episode, so I'm counting this one as our first episode back.
Yeah, who would have thought we'd make it that far?
I don't know. 16 episodes, that's pretty good, actually. If you count in the IdioFactoids as well, that's quite a few episodes.
Yeah, and up until very recently, our most popular episode was our first episode, which was Helicopters and Reiki, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. If anyone's going to get introduced to the podcast, they're probably going to start at episode 1, which is a real shame because from our point of view, it's probably the worst one. Like, it was the most fun one because we were all excited and new, and
we also had no idea what we were doing.
No idea. Neither of us had ever spoken into a proper microphone before or done anything.
Well, in fact, in the first episode, we didn't even have proper microphones. We used our gaming headsets.
Yeah, so the audio quality sounds like we're speaking to each other through a banana muffin or something.
It sounds like we're talking like this.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome to IdioFacto.
So Matt's voice sounded even worse.
Yeah, well, according to my mum,
So that was up until recently, but then something happened in the last few weeks, I guess it was. Our episode on climate change is now by far our most popular. Yeah, and it seems to have gained a fair bit of popularity since the Greta Thunberg speech, which makes sense, I guess, because it's quite topical. People are searching climate change, which means that all of those hashtags paid off.
I guess so.
I guess.
I had a long discussion with a friend on Facebook this afternoon about, admittedly, he hadn't listened to the episode, so he was kind of coming at it from a position of ignorance, but...
And you were trying to spruik him your propaganda, you unqualified piece of crap.
I was. One of the things really kind of got to me was he said that basically, who am I to tell people about science? Even though he said, I know you studied science at uni, but who are you to tell people about science? And I thought, well, I mean, having a Bachelor of Science does somewhat qualify me to talk about science, more than a layperson anyway. But then also you don't need any sort of qualification to recognise and call out bad argumentation in the form of logical fallacies. You just need to understand logical fallacies.
We don't, and that's a bit of a contradiction to what we've kind of said before, is because I know that when we spoke about Simon Sinek, we said that he was gravely unqualified to speak about some of the topics that he does. But I think the difference is that we're not professing to be experts in a certain topic, and we're not spreading anything that's our own research or even our own opinion. We just understand good scientific method, I suppose.
Yeah, this is not my opinion. I use evidence to come to a conclusion and then present that conclusion and the supporting evidence. It doesn't require qualifications. I'm riding on the coattails of everybody else's work, really.
That's right, yeah. It's just meta-analysis in a way.
Yeah, or even just the presentation of meta-analyses.
Yeah.
Anyway, in that vein, let's get back into it, shall we?
I think we should. And we've kind of intentionally chosen topics this week that sort of slot together pretty well, I think.
And are quite topical in their own way.
So I've gone space travel.
Space travel.
Yeah, which sounded awesome at the time. And like most things that I get myself into, I thought, how hard could this be? But yeah, it's really like space travel, as I've come to the conclusion, it's really too big to cover everything in any sort of forum that we do in an hour-long episode.
Yeah.
I've kind of try and cover some of the essentials, and I might go more into depth on several of the aspects later. But after researching all of this, I've realised that almost every topic that I'm skimming over really could be its own episode.
Yeah, well, there's not one technology that goes into space travel.
Exactly right, yeah. And there's so much history in it. There's so many different advancements. Just about every field of science has been involved in space travel at some stage. So I suppose, where do we start with space travel? Well, I guess we can start with the observable stars and what we know as space, which begs the question, what is space? The generally accepted definition of space is that it begins at the Kármán line, which is about 100 kilometres above sea level.
So where on Earth is the Kármán San Diego line? Get that one?
Get that
one? It was bad.
But you said where on Earth. I think you're supposed to say where in time. Where in time is Kármán San Diego?
No, it's where on Earth is Kármán San Diego, man.
I don't think so.
I'm going to look this up.
The game that I had was where in time is Kármán San Diego.
Where on Earth is Kármán San Diego? American animated series.
Now type in where in time is Kármán San Diego.
No, I'm sure that's a thing too, but you're wrong.
Anyway, we're not talking about Kármán. We're talking about Kárman.
Oh, okay. Well, you should have told me that earlier.
Well,
I wouldn't have made a silly joke about it.
Very silly.
No, I would have. I still would have.
You absolutely still would have. Anyway, you've thrown me off big time, and I forgot what I'm even covering this week.
You'll be fine. Space travel.
Yeah, that's right. So outer space begins at the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometres above sea level. So space travel is defined as leaving this zone above the Earth's surface. So anything that travels further than 100 kilometres from the Earth at sea level has entered space. So we haven't really always known what space was. Nature kind of does abhor a vacuum, but we now know that space is not impossible, obviously. Are you playing a song in the background? What is going on?
It's where on Earth is Kármán San Diego? Where on Earth is... It's the theme song to the TV show. I was just proving that I was correct, that's all.
Am I a joke to you?
Yes. That's all you are to me, Levi. It's a big fat joke.
It's not fat, it's big bones.
No, it's big muscles now. You big weightlifter?
Well, getting there. Hey, I'm not a weightlifter. I'm a powerlifter.
Powerlifter. Oh, that's a difference, yeah. Sorry, please. Continue with your space travel.
No, you've had your little time in the spotlight. Let me just hang on. What is this here? There you go. Where in time is Kármán San Diego? I'll put a link in the show notes to where in time is Kármán San Diego.
Okay. Anyway, continue with space travel. Stop being silly, Levi. Get back to it.
Come on. Stop mucking around. We are well out of practice.
Yeah, we are.
I'm like 3 sentences into my notes. I've got another 12 pages to go, so you better buckle up.
Okay.
Humans haven't always known what stars were, which makes sense. Like, can you imagine before... I mean, you were taught what stars were, but can you imagine the early humans looking up at the night sky and seeing just all of these dots? I mean, I've heard that, stars are the holes to heaven or the holes in the sky or that kind of thing. But obviously humans and the nature of humans means that we always want to know what's actually up there. So I guess that curiosity sparked things like the first telescope. So there was this guy called Hans Lippershey, and he was a Dutch-German spectacle maker. And in 1608, he applied for the first patent for the first ever telescope. Now, whether or not he actually invented it is unknown, but this was the start of the 17th century that saw the world's first telescopes. So telescopes got more and more complicated, but they've allowed us to learn so much about space before we left Earth, or before we even sent anything from the Earth's surface up into the sky. And there probably should be an episode in itself on telescopes, because we've spoken briefly about them in the past, but they're pretty complex and amazing bits of machinery.
And we've both visited a couple, so...
Yeah, we have. So after looking into space, obviously, humans decided to attempt to leave Earth, but it wasn't quite that easy. So I sort of tried to put a list together of some of the challenges of entering space or leaving Earth, and there's heaps. As you can imagine, but I'll talk about a few of them. So firstly, you have to leave Earth, which means overcoming Earth's gravity and the friction from the atmosphere. And to do this, you need to reach what's called escape velocity, which is around about 40,000 kilometers per hour, or around about 20,000 miles per hour for our American listeners. That's to escape entirely, escape the gravity well of Earth. Now, to enter orbit, or to reach orbital velocity, that's about 75% of that speed. It's still 20 times the speed of sound.
Right.
So we're talking incredible speeds here just to leave the Earth's surface and burst out through the atmosphere. Fortunately, though, once you're in space, you don't lose any of that speed because there's no friction. So it's free speed. You can just use what you've generated on Earth and just keep on going until something stops you.
And the force of gravity is significantly less once you're out of the gravity well of Earth, so...
It is. Well, yeah, the further away that you get from any object, the lesser the effect of gravity. So obviously to reach these speeds requires lots of propulsive forces, usually in the form of gas or liquid-fueled rockets. And as you can imagine, this gets very expensive. Everything is expensive about space travel.
Yeah. Well, I'll touch on this later as well, but...
Yes. I read somewhere that SpaceX launches cost about $57 million per launch, which equates to about $5,500 per kilogram launched from the Earth's surface into space.
Yeah, and when we talked about the space elevator as a concept as well back in season 1, that was one of the major advantages to a space elevator system is even though at the moment it's impossible to set up, but the main cost of getting into space is the first part of it, getting off Earth. And it costs so much per kilogram to get off Earth that if we could overcome that and mine materials from, say, the moon or an asteroid or somewhere like that to a space station that wasn't right within Earth's gravity, like on the surface, for example, but like maybe not quite geostationary, but an orbit around Earth, then that would save us a significant amount of money, which is kind of the concept behind a space elevator, but also the concept behind orbital satellites as well.
Well, this, you kind of touched on the cost comes in, though, getting to space. It also comes in the actual parts that you use and the technology and manufacturing the rockets and all that kind of thing, which was one of SpaceX's justifications behind the renewable rockets, because you've got the economy of scale. So if you can reuse a rocket time and time again, each launch essentially gets cheaper because you don't have to rebuild a rocket and you don't have to redesign it. You've already got it sitting there.
Yeah.
Another difficult part about getting into space is that we have to take everything with us. All resources are finite and must be kept inside the space travel vessel. So even the ISS that we touched on in an episode gets refills, and it's close. Like even that is very, very expensive. But you got to remember, it's relatively quite close to the Earth's surface.
Yeah, but in order to get there, you still have to overcome Earth's gravity. So it doesn't reduce that cost of getting out of the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah, that's true. But we don't have to spend the time, I guess, keeping humans alive to get there. Like you can sort of if we need something up there, you can send a rocket up and supplies will reach it in a matter of hours, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So something else that's quite challenging about space is that it will try and kill you. It's almost a perfect vacuum, so it'll literally make your blood boil. It sucks gases out of your body, out of your blood, so you'll be unconscious in raw space, shall we call it, without a suit. You'll be unconscious in about 12 seconds, even if you're holding your breath, and you'll be dead in 2 minutes. So freezing cold temperatures, it gets down to about minus 200 degrees Celsius in the shade, and about 100 degrees Celsius in the full sun. So the sun's radiation is super dangerous as well because there's no atmosphere. There's no air molecules to stop this radiation or this radiant heat from reaching you. It will just about cook you, which is why spacesuit design and spacecraft design is so incredible. It's so important. It has to be so strong and so reliable because you're putting living things in it, and it has to be able to hold up under these super adverse conditions. So that's why you're in space. The other really dangerous part is re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. So as we said, you have to speed up to about 40,000 kilometers per hour while you're in space, and you don't lose that speed while you're in space. But then slowing down from that speed, right down to a speed that won't kill you when you hit the Earth's surface. This generates immense heat and G-force stresses on the spacecraft, and obviously on the humans inside it if they're not well enough protected, which just makes me think, aren't engineers amazing? Isn't science amazing to be able to do this?
Yeah, I mean, everything about the whole process wants to kill us. And even we've been doing this for such a long time with what we would see today as such primitive technology.
Yeah.
We were still able to do it. Even the ISS, the technology in the ISS is outdated now, and it's not that old, but it's done its job.
That's what amazes me, and I'll touch on it a little bit more later on, but space travel advanced so quickly, and then it kind of hasn't really gone anywhere. Like, you're right, the ISS, it's still using quite old technology, and it obviously works. I mean, we're digging stuff up out of the ground and turning it into a material that will literally keep us alive in an environment that otherwise would kill us within seconds or minutes. It's incredible. Anyway, that was just a little rant. Another difficult part is that to explore our solar system, our galaxy or the universe, it takes so long because everything is so far away.
Like, incomprehensibly far away.
Like, do you want to take a guess at how far away the moon is from Earth? Well, you probably know because you've been researching the moon.
I don't know exactly. It's a couple of days, maybe, by a conventional spacecraft.
So in terms of distance, it's 384,400 kilometers away from Earth, which means that it takes 9 hours in a straight line to get there at 40,000 kilometers per hour, which is escape velocity.
Wow, okay. Yeah, right.
But it actually takes longer due to gravity, and the rocket that you're attached to doesn't actually travel in a straight line. It's got to escape gravity wells, so it has to orbit the Earth several times, gradually increasing in altitude, and then it has to enter lunar orbit. So there's all these sorts of things that mean it can't just travel in a straight line, obviously. But so that's a long way away. 384,000 kilometers. It actually took the first moonwalkers about 3 days to get there.
Okay, that's probably why I thought that it was about a couple of days.
I'm sure you may touch on this, but so that's the moon. That's a long way away. How about Mars? Have you ever thought about how close Mars is?
6 months at the similar speed?
Oh, I didn't actually work out the time frame, but in terms of kilometers, it's 225 million kilometers away. So do you get the picture? Like, these are celestial bodies within our own solar system.
Yeah, Mars is the closest planet to us. Is that correct? Am I correct in saying that? Mars is the closest planet to us. And even that is many millions of kilometers away.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it would take us months to get there at the maximum speed that we can make a thing go with humans inside it. So if we want to leave our own solar system, which is still considered fairly close, it's going to take years.
Well, I know the probe that they sent to Pluto was launched like 25 years ago, wasn't it? And it's only recently gone past.
Yeah, it's incredible traveling at this escape velocity. Yeah, it's unreal. Humans are amazing, and they've worked out ways to overcome all of this. And we've actually gotten stuff into space despite all of these challenges. So the first man-made object into space was the German-made V2A4 liquid-propelled rocket. And this was launched during World War II. And I'll say it, war's terrible, but it's really great for scientific advancement.
Yeah.
And medical advancements.
I'm going to sound like I'm constantly in Facebook arguments, but I try to steer clear of them. But
Keyboard warrior. The
Australian government's just pledged $150 million to the US space program. And I made the argument that the three most influential events of the 20th century in regards to technological and medical progress were World War I, World War II, and going to the moon. So of those three things, I think I'd rather be investing in going to the moon than in a world war.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I've got no problem in the governments of the world spending a lot of money leaving Earth and trying to colonize other planets.
On a side note, I know we don't like to get political here, but given that Australia is one of the most affluent countries in the world, I think we do have our own problems at home, but spending $150 million, which is, in the scheme of things, not that much money,
no.
In the scheme of our GDP, that's quite a good investment, considering the payoff that it could potentially have for future generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
It's just because we're spending that money on space travel doesn't mean we shouldn't spend money on other things, but I think that most scientists, most skeptical people or skeptical thinkers would agree that one of the best things we can do for technological progress is invest in space travel.
Yeah, and $150 million for space travel is peanuts compared to what we spend on defense.
So we're already a lot more political this season than we were last.
Joe Rogan will be asking us to come on and have a chat.
Oh, no, hope not.
No thanks. Decline that one. So this German rocket essentially sparked the space race. It was the first thing that a human made and got beyond this Kármán line. So the object, often quoted as the first man-made object in space, and probably because it stayed there in orbit for a little while, was Sputnik 1. And this was a Soviet satellite. Sputnik means satellite. This was launched in 1957, about 3 weeks before my dad was born.
Your dad old.
He old. Shout out to Keith Bateman.
Hey, Keith.
Hey, Keith. I don't call him Keith, by the way. I call him Dad.
I do, but I probably could call him my dad, given that he's my father-in-law, kind of. Phoebe and I aren't married, but...
Nah, I'd still call him Keith.
I'll stick with Keith.
Anyway, this was a pretty cool feat, I suppose, to get something into space and to keep it there. But just a month later, just 1 month later, the USSR launched the first living Earth-dwelling mammal into space. And I say it this way because there were probably bacteria on the rockets and on Sputnik, but they kind of don't get credited as the first Earthlings to enter space, unfortunately, because we don't really know that they were there. And they probably burnt up on the way out. But anyway, so we'll get to this mammal. So you might have heard of this. So Laika the dog was launched into space aboard Sputnik 2. So Laika the Cosmonaught was a stray picked up from the streets of Russia, and she was chosen for the mission based on her size and demeanour. So she was small, and she was very friendly and calm.
Was she small or was she small?
She was small.
Small.
Yeah.
A small pupper.
Small pupper. Looked a bit like a Jack Russell, actually. She is very cute. Was very cute. So she was launched into space, and get your tissues. Gets a little bit sad. So this brave girl died after about 2 hours from stress and from overheating. It was originally reported that after 5 days in space, she died peacefully. That wasn't the case. Apparently it was in the first couple of hours. So
in Soviet Russia, a satellite kills you.
Yes. It sounds kind of cruel and it makes me want to cry buckets, but we wouldn't have gone to space without lots of testing on animals other than human beings.
Well, keep the tissues out because when we tried to go to the moon, we lost a whole lot of astronauts in the process.
Oh, God. Speaking of which, on the 12th of April, 1961, 27-year-old cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, and I didn't know he was quite so young, became the first human being to enter space and return home again.
I'm nearly 30 and I have never been to space.
You haven't?
No. Makes me question what I've done with my life, really.
Well, not gone to space, I can tell you that. So Yuri left, and then he was home again. He was back on Earth again. About 2 hours, and he completed one full orbit. Orbit? I've conflated Earth and orbit, but I think you got the point. I'm not even going to try and say that sentence properly. So this was obviously a massive advancement in space travel, and it proved that it was possible to keep a human being alive in space and return them safely back to Earth, sometimes. And it sparked a new era of space travel, which was human spaceflight. And all of this, amazingly, less than 60 years after the Wright brothers' first ever flight in 1903. The first time a human ever left the ground on a piece of machinery. 60 years later, we're flying around in space, which is an incredibly fast technological progression. I was going to talk about humans on other celestial bodies, and I'll just briefly touch on it because I don't want to step on your toes here.
Cut my grass, Levi. Cut my grass.
It's one sentence.
All right.
I'm just going to say, in the same decade as the Russians launched Yuri into space, USA launched the first humans into space and put them on the moon.
Are you sure?
Just what I read, man. I know I shouldn't believe everything I read on the internet.
Gotta be careful. NASA and them lies, man.
Well, for that reason, I'm not going to say any more on it. Well, like I said before, there's too much relating to space travel to go into it, which is a shame because I stumbled upon so many cool stories about rockets and satellites, each with a different purpose and a different story. Like, we currently have humans living in space on the International Space Station.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing.
And you can listen to an episode on that, IdioFacto 14. This really is such an amazing feat, isn't it? It
still blows my mind to think that there are currently humans orbiting around Earth on a piece of machinery.
Yeah.
It just, it doesn't seem real.
Yeah. And that's not the only man-made object in space, obviously. There's hundreds of satellites that orbit the Earth constantly. Some of them are used for GPS, which you can learn about in IdioFacto 8.
Wow, you're all about the throwbacks today.
And there are robots exploring Mars. Literally, humans made robots, sent them into space, and now they're rolling around Mars, which I'm pretty sure is going to be a future episode because that's amazing. And I haven't touched on it here because I really want to go in depth with it.
So this is like a brief introduction to space travel, basically. And
it is. Oh, big time.
Stay tuned for more episodes later on.
And like I said, I don't know what I was expecting. I really can't do it any justice. But yeah, I'm just talking about some cool stuff that I'm going to maybe talk about later. So the Voyager 1 is the first human-made object to leave our solar system. It was followed by 4 others, but the Voyager 1 was the first one. So who knows what they will find. Interestingly, how far do you think humans have been from Earth?
I guess we're limited by the speed that the objects can travel and the length of time that we've been exploring space. So, at 40,000 kilometers an hour? Just let me get my calculator. I really want to guess this, so I'm going to do a little bit of maths. So 40,000 kilometers an hour times 24 hours in a day times 365 days in a year times, say, 45 years.
Wait, what do you think the question is? I'm talking about a living human being.
Oh. I thought you meant like human objects.
Oh, nah.
Oh, I don't think. How far have we gone?
Yeah.
The moon?
Yeah, so I don't know. I've never really thought about this, but during the Apollo 13 mission, the spacecraft flew behind the dark side of the moon at an altitude of around about 240 kilometers above the moon's surface. And that is as far away as humans have been from Earth. Like, we've walked on the moon and we've kind of cruised around the moon, but it's a really good point because once you get to the moon, if you go any further, if you leave the moon's gravity well, there is no way to get home.
Yeah.
You have no propulsion in space.
Yeah, because the way they get home from the moon is they do an orbit around the moon and kind of fling themselves back like a slingshot.
And you can use very slight propulsion changes to alter your trajectory, but you can't pull up in the middle of space and then blast the spacecraft back in the other direction. It would take such a huge amount of energy.
It's not like Star Wars.
Exactly.
Once you're going, you're going. You would have to use almost as much fuel to stop.
That's right. So that's as far as we've been. So what's the next logical step with space travel? Is it space elevators, as we spoke about in IdioFacto 5?
The logical next step, I would say, would be to establish some sort of permanent base, either in orbit or on the moon.
Yeah, well, we kind of have one in orbit, I suppose, in the ISS, but according to many sources, and NASA included, the next logical step is for space exploration is colonizing Mars. And you can imagine the potential is huge. Like, if we can inhabit another planet, we could mine it. We could mine nearby asteroids. We could grow food. If we run out of space, we could send resources back to Earth if we run out. Like, the possibilities are endless. And NASA are actually planning on having humans on a Mars mission sometime in the 2030s at this stage.
But would it not be more logical to set up a base or a colony on the moon since it's so much closer? Like within a couple of days travel as opposed to a few months? What if something happens and they get disconnected? Like,
I suppose
surely
so.
It makes more sense to be on the moon.
Because you can get back from the moon, can't you?
Well, we've proven that we can get back from the moon.
Yeah, I think it's just that Mars is fairly similar to Earth. Like, it has a 24-hour day. You know, it sort of has seasons, I guess. It's a similar size to Earth. So I'm really excited about the future of space travel, but I'm also kind of a little bit saddened by the fact that it probably won't necessarily happen in my lifetime. But I'll leave you with a quote from your mate Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, which I think you actually referenced in the Space Elevators episode.
Yeah.
He said, "The Earth is the cradle of humanity, but mankind cannot stay in the cradle forever." Which I think is great because, you know, humans, obviously we were born here, we were in our infancy here, but like a cradle, we'll leave one day.
Okay, so space travel really got into its groove in the 1960s, I guess you could say.
Along with the music, baby.
A lot of groovy stuff happened in the 1960s.
Sure did.
Like you said, humans finally landed on the moon after a decade of trying on the 20th of July 1969. So 50 years ago, as of July this year. So the event, the actual stepping off the platform of the lander onto the lunar surface, was broadcast via the Parkes radio telescope, which I visited on my road trip around New South Wales with Phoebe.
That's great. That's such a cool story.
Yeah, there's nothing in Parkes in New South Wales. It's if for anyone who's seen the really good Australian movie called The Dish,
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's in the middle of a sheep paddock, and it still is to this day, still just a massive radio telescope in the middle of a sheep paddock, but it is definitely worth seeing. And it played a pivotal role in the live broadcast of the landing of humans on the moon. So it's one of the most amazing achievements, I think, inarguably one of the most amazing achievements of the human race to date, that despite overwhelming odds and woefully inadequate technology compared to today's standards at least, humans were able to leave our planet, set foot on another celestial body, and then return home without incident.
Yeah, that's unreal. We talked about some of the challenges of leaving space and getting home again, but these guys actually got out and walked around on a planet that we didn't know if it was going to swallow us up.
Well, I mean, we kind of did. We had decades worth of research as a background to that trip, so we were pretty confident that we knew what we were getting ourselves into, but there was no solid proof.
Right.
If you excuse the pun. So despite this amazing achievement in human history, there are still millions of people who believe that we actually didn't land on the moon and that NASA is involved in a hoax that's lasted for 50 years.
I don't know where these hoaxes come from, and I don't know, like, of all the crazy cool things that humans do, like, which ones do we choose to spread a conspiracy theory about?
My theory is that this is just such an unbelievable achievement that it becomes, for some people, literally unbelievable. It seems so unlikely that we were able to do it with such primitive technology, and therefore there must be something wrong. It must be faked.
It was all a competition, and there were several nations, Russia and the US, that were all competing to be the biggest superpower. And I guess walking on the moon, this was the next frontier, wasn't it? And so I guess there were probably people that thought they were making it up and claiming the win, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That is a major motive that's put forward by the conspiracists, but we'll get into that. Recent polls, in fact, consistently polls over the last 40 years, have put the approximate number of disbelievers at 5% of the US population.
What?
Which doesn't seem like a huge amount until you realise that it's about 16.5 million people.
No, that's more than I thought.
Yeah, it's massive. And it also seems to be increasing as we move further away from the event itself.
Oh, no.
So the closer you are to the event, the more likely you are to believe that it's a thing that actually happened.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm guessing every flat earther must believe that it was faked, right?
Well, yeah, it would not make much sense to believe in a flat earth.
Well,
but
their argument doesn't make much sense anyway, but...
No, but that's another episode in itself. So there are many arguments made by conspiracy theorists about how the moon landing was faked. Some are outright ridiculous and some are somewhat harder to explain away without looking into it a bit further.
And in the words of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, space may be the final frontier, but it's made in a Hollywood basement. Yeah,
well, popular media like that doesn't help. There's actually a scene in a James Bond movie, I think it might be Moonraker or Diamonds Are Forever or one of those later ones where Bond actually drives through a set where there's people in spacesuits kind of moving around the moon set. So, yeah, it's been reinforced by a whole bunch of popular media as well. With all that in mind, it seems appropriate that we address some of the more popular and credible arguments against the moon landings. So I'm going to play a video of an interview with a guy named Matthew Reel, or Rael, or I think it's Reel, Matthew Reel.
No, let's keep it real.
Well, despite the ironic name, believes that we didn't really land on the moon. Mm-hmm. And I realise this is one person who's making these arguments, but he articulates some of the more popular arguments among the conspiracy theorists.
Okay.
This is him introducing himself.
I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't have any real hard opinions on JFK. I don't necessarily think Bush did 9/11. I don't believe that the government is putting chemicals in the sky. What are other conspiracy theories?
Area 51.
Oh, I do kind of think that something happened at Area 51. I got into reading up a lot on conspiracy theories, and a lot of the times it's all baloney. I go in specifically to debunk them, and I did so with the moon landing. So I started to read more stuff about the moon landing. After I started to debunk certain parts of it, there were some things that I couldn't explain. I don't think that we landed on the moon in 1969, or ever.
So it's a classic conspiracy theorist argument saying, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in this and this and this. And then at one stage they mention Area 51 and he goes, Oh, yeah, I do kind of believe that something happened at Area 51. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist except when it suits me.
And another common line that you hear a lot of them say, and I know a lot of flat earthers say, is I started to look into it and I fell down the rabbit hole, or something similar to that. Like, I paid attention to it and I found all this information that had plain as day to be staring me right in the face, but I'd never paid attention to it, as though there's all this real evidence that's out there that we're just not woke enough to see. It's
common for a conspiracy theorist to say, I actually would debunk conspiracy theories. I would think they were ridiculous and go in and that sort of attitude. But obviously, I guess they've engaged in conspiracy thinking.
Yep.
Whether or not they admit that they have. So obviously, he's found things personally difficult to explain and has therefore decided that it must be a conspiracy. So let's look at his arguments.
Say this is the photo of the moon. We got the rocks and the moon here. Let's say the sun is over here, right? Well, we got shadows naturally this way, but in some occasions, there are shadows competing. This would suggest another light source over here, sending the shadow this way. If you're on the moon, there wouldn't be two light sources. There would only be the one, the sun.
So he does a pretty bad job of explaining this concept, but it is very popular among moon landing conspiracists.
I've heard this one.
There are photos released by NASA that appear to show shadows going in completely different directions. Mm-hmm. The most compelling of these shows an astronaut in the center of the frame with the shadow extending straight out at 12 o'clock. And in the top right-hand corner of the frame, there's a rock that appears to be only several meters away that has a shadow extending at about 10 o'clock.
Mm.
So he's right. The moon does only have one light source, but the lighting on the moon is unusual, especially when we're used to the way that light and shadows behave on Earth. So the light source on the moon is direct sun, unfiltered by atmosphere. So the moon is far from a flat surface. It has a smaller diameter than Earth, and the surface is pockmarked by craters and undulations, and it hasn't been weathered because there's no atmosphere and there's no weather. Mm. So this can make shadows appear longer than they should or to be going in the wrong direction. And secondly, the moon's surface is highly reflective of sunlight because of the composition of the regolith, which is the moon dust. The dirt on the moon is very reflective. So it bounces light in unexpected ways, especially when those undulations cause it to bounce light in a weird way. The white material of the spacesuits that the photos were taken from also provide a highly reflective surface, especially in unfiltered sunlight, direct sunlight.
So you're saying basically the surface of the moon and anything that's on it becomes a light source of its own?
Pretty much, yeah, but to a varying degree. The biggest thing is that in this particular photos case, the biggest thing is that the photos were taken using wide-angle lenses. And so when you correct photos taken with a wide-angle lens so that they look two-dimensional and they don't look like they've got rounded edges, objects towards the edges of the frame can distort and change direction, basically.
Right.
So any combination of all of these factors, just the wide-angle lens, just the reflective surface, just the craters and the undulations, or any combination of them altogether, explain all of the discrepancies in the shadows in the photos.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
And Mythbusters addressed a couple of these issues in an episode they did on the moon landing hoax, which is worth a watch. I know the Mythbusters are not the most rigorously scientific of testers, but it does show that the effect of competing shadows can be reproduced with a single light source.
Okay.
And therefore, Occam's razor would suggest that it's more likely that the photos were taken on the moon and not taken under studio lights with several light sources.
Okay.
They do quite a good debunk of the shadow argument.
Right.
So it's worth a watch. I'll put the link in the show notes.
Just quickly, this Matthew Real, whatever his name is, when was this video made? Is this current?
No, it was recorded in January of 2018.
Oh, right, okay. So the internet's well and truly around.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's not that old, but it's also, you'll find out later that some of his arguments are already out of date.
Okay.
Here's another one of his arguments popular among conspiracy theorists.
There are a lot of discrepancies based on the footage of the moon landing. And a lot of those I don't necessarily believe are good hard arguments. What can't be explained away is the crosshairs on the photos. In the images of the NASA moon landing, these are photos that NASA took and released. There are moments where the crosshairs, which are fixed to the camera, actually lie behind equipment. The theory is that the only way that the crosshairs would be behind a piece of equipment in a photo would be if the piece of equipment was superimposed. This happens on a couple of occasions in the NASA photos, and to me, I don't know how you get around it.
He doesn't know how you get around.
He doesn't. No, you can't explain that.
No, that's...
My first, just really quick answer is, if you're going to go to the effort of making a studio with studio lighting and actors and spacesuits and a moon surface, why would you need to superimpose anything?
Yeah, well, that is a legitimate argument, yeah, but there's a better argument that combats the actual concept that he's putting forward. Even if you accept that someone in a studio forgot to put an object there and then went, oh, we better superimpose that over the film before it goes to the public. The cameras that were taking the photos were fitted with a Rousseau plate, which is a plate of clear glass with very thin black reticles etched on it. So it just looks like a whole bunch of crosshairs. If you see any picture from the moon, you'll see these crosshairs in it. This disappearing crosshair effect doesn't happen in any of the original photos. It only happens on copied, scanned, and edited versions, and only on white objects.
Oh, right.
And it's due almost entirely to a loss of fidelity, given that the crosshairs are so thin, and the contrast of the photos is changed, and it leads to the overexposure of the white objects. So it just means that the white comes up really bright and overshadows the very thin black crosshairs.
Well, we can cross that one off the list.
It's very easily disproved, and obviously nobody has sat down and told him this explanation.
Maybe I haven't been using enough puns. Did you hear that? That just went straight over your head, I think.
Oh, maybe, yeah. What did you say?
We can cross that one off the list. Because you're talking about crosshairs.
I'm not paying that one.
Oh.
If you'd said we can crosshair that one off the list.
No, you don't. Do you know how
Yeah, you don't. Don't you tell me how. No, not paying that at all.
All right.
Next argument.
The lack of artifacts. The easiest way to prove that we've been to the moon is to show people the things on the moon. However, everyone insists we don't have telescopes big enough to see the shit we put on the moon. The going argument is that to be visible from our best telescopes, something would have to be a little bit larger than a small house. That's nuts.
Did you say it would have to be a little bit bigger than a small house?
Yes, that's true. That is still true. We do still lack a telescope on Earth that can provide resolution good enough to see anything smaller than a small house.
Yeah. Well, the moon's, while it's much smaller than the Earth, it's still huge.
Yeah, and while it's much closer than any other celestial body, it's still very far away.
Yeah.
Anyway, this argument may have been somewhat compelling when the interview was recorded in January of 2018, although many would and could point to the fact that we physically brought back moon rocks and regolith as evidence that we were on the moon.
Could have got it anywhere.
Well, yes, that is what they say, and they... Anyway.
Gotcha. That was a real gotcha moment.
Yeah, it was a gotcha. As of July 2019, however, this argument has been completely debunked. It's true that we still lack a telescope on Earth that can provide the resolution, but in July of 2019, NASA's new Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is a spacecraft that is a satellite of the moon now, it dipped down low enough to take some photos of the surface of the moon, where the landing sites of the Apollo missions 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 can be clearly seen, complete with astronaut footprint paths and discarded lunar modules. So all of the equipment that they left there is obviously still there, and the footprint paths that they took to get between the equipment also still there, and also very clear. I'll put a link down in the show notes to the pictures. It's very obvious that these are the landing sites.
That's all really cool, but also I think the argument from these conspiracy theorists, these anti-landers, can I call them that? I don't know if anyone else calls them that. That's what I'm calling them.
Okay, we can if you want.
Is that it's not a camera on Earth. It's still a camera that is in space, and if we've made up the moon landing, then maybe we could make up those photos.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But we'll continue on, and we'll use Occam's razor to its full extent, shall we say, in the following arguments.
I'm not disagreeing with you, by the way. I
know that. You're being devil's advocate. Yeah, that's fine. That's a fair enough point, but it's wrong. So
Oh, well, I know.
I'll continue on and we'll get to that point and more in a minute.
Please do.
A lot of people suggest that the footage is just slowed down half speed. We shot it in a Hollywood studio, jumped around, drove a lunar lander around sand, and then just cut it by half the speed. You take the actual footage from the moon landing, you do double speed, it looks almost exactly like a normal car driving around on a beach. Really very interesting. Look into it.
If you actually do look into it, you'll find that there are many reasons why the chances of this actually being the method that they used are vanishingly small. Firstly, if you require twice the frame rate, then you require twice the storage space. So that's assuming that it was filmed on magnetic disc recorders for television broadcast or on film if using 35mm film. It wasn't. It was broadcast live from the moon to Earth. So if you were to record twice the number of frames on Earth, you would require twice the storage space, which it would have required magnetic storage capabilities that were almost 3,000 times more advanced than anything available in 1969.
Wow.
Or known to be available in 1969. So even if you make the argument that, NASA gets all the best technology before anyone else, 3,000 times more advanced than anything else available in 1969, even that's a stretch for conspiracy theorists, surely. If the footage was recorded on film, it would have required 6.5 reels of film that would need to be spliced together, which would show telltale signs of being spliced together. And in any case, none of the footage displays any of the artifacts typical of film, like grain, dust, hair, scratches, anything that you see on old film.
Right, okay.
Even if we accept that these things were possible in 1969, which they weren't, the Mythbusters episode attempted to reproduce the footage with modern technology using several means. The only one that looked marginally similar to the actual footage was when they boarded a zero-G plane that could simulate the moon's gravity.
Oh, okay.
That episode's definitely worth a watch. They tried using a gravity simulator, like a bungee system that made Adam Savage weigh effectively what he would on the moon, and he tried to do the spacewalk, and it looked okay, but it didn't look exactly like it. They tried recording at twice the frame rate and slowing it down, and it didn't look anything like it. So here is a good example. We have two competing hypotheses. The first is that the footage was taken on the moon and broadcast live using known technology of the time. Or the second is that the footage was taken on Earth using technology that wasn't available, or it was kept secret indefinitely, and many people have lied over many years to keep that fact covered up. So which of these hypotheses requires the fewest assumptions?
The number one.
Obviously, the one that everyone has said is what happened and makes the most sense given the situation.
Yeah, big time.
Here's another one.
My theory is we didn't really have the technology to do so. Look at the computers that they were using in the mission control. They were like 16-bit computers. They were like TI-83 calculators.
So this is a common argument that we lacked the technology to get to the moon in 1969. Actually, it's far more likely that we lacked the technology to fake going to the moon in 1969.
Okay.
Yes, the technology they used was to our modernized primitive, but it worked. And if it worked to do the things it needed to do, then it worked well enough. Just because you find it hard to believe doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There are a lot of other arguments from conspiracy theorists, and if we were to address them all, it would take several episodes. So let's end with one of the hardest things to explain away for a conspiracy theorist: the motives for NASA to undertake such a huge hoax.
Let's start with the motive of why the US government would have faked the moon landing. Cold War is number one. We were at it with the Russians. JFK came out in 1961 and said, you know what, by the end of the decade, we're gonna go to the moon. And then therefore, we had to do it. That's JFK, that's our guy. And we supposedly beat them. We didn't. There were concerns that Russia was gonna build a missile base on the moon. Sounds crazy, but it's not. And it's what people believe. As that decade progressed, we are not making the strides that we see Russia making. They put Yuri Gagarin out into space before we did, and that was scary.
It is true that the Russians made a lot of progress in the 60s, so much so that they were able to track the NASA mission to the moon. So why would Russia, the only real rival to the US during the Cold War, sit back and just accept that the Americans were able to land on the moon before them if they believed it to be faked?
That's right. Why wouldn't they fake their own moon landing?
well, why wouldn't they pull up the Americans and say, wait a minute, we tracked you and you didn't go anywhere near the moon?
Yeah.
Actually, this hoax would require more conspirators than just NASA or the US government. The whole world accepted that it happened the way NASA described. And in fact, the Australian government helped so closely that it was the CSIRO telescope that provided the footage of the landing itself to the world.
We're talking about a lot of assumptions here.
Yeah, exactly. And the sheer number of people that would need to be involved in this conspiracy for 50 years without slipping up or blowing the whistle is mind-boggling. It just does not make any sense at all. This is the biggest reason why this conspiracy theory is as ridiculous as the flat earth conspiracy.
It's actually quite infuriating. And as with most conspiracy theorists, you cannot reason with them. You cannot provide them with this evidence and have them that there's always a counter-argument. And it usually doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and like I said, there's literally hundreds of other arguments from conspiracy theorists based on one or two photos with explanations that they have scientific explanations. They are just not interested in what the scientific explanation is.
Yeah.
It's far better for them to believe in their conspiracy theory. They twist the facts to suit their theory, whereas you should change your theory to suit the facts.
Yes.
So, if we were able to land 12 men on the moon between 1969 and 1972, why haven't we done it in the 47 years since? The simplest answer, and you touched on this before, is that it's incredibly expensive. Mm-hmm. In the decade up until 1972, NASA had a budget that averaged about 3% of the total US federal budget.
Wow. Between
1972 and 1997, the average was closer to 1%, and in the last 15 years, the average is more like 0.5%.
Wow.
In other words, the NASA of the 1960s had a budget about 6 times higher than it is today. So combine that with the political and social will to beat the Russians to the moon, and the atmosphere that cultivated moon exploration hasn't been replicated since. And the various administrations of the United States, as I touched on before, have had vastly different priorities in the intervening time. For example, under Obama, NASA were instructed to concentrate on exploring near-Earth asteroids, and Trump scrapped that plan in 2016 and instructed NASA to concentrate on going back to the moon. We will go to the moon again one day, but in the meantime, we will continue to enjoy the sheer achievement of having done it with the most primitive technologies in a time where there was unprecedented public support of a scientific endeavour. That's it for this episode of IdioFacto. Forward all suggestions, hate mail, evidence and arguments to idiofacto@gmail.com.
And you can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and all of the social platforms by searching IdioFacto. Links are in the show notes. The first mermaid into space. Nope. The first
mermaid into space.
There have been no mermaids found in
that'll,
space.
That'll set off the conspiracy theorists.
Oh God, don't start it. Do not.
Now NASA are claiming that they sent mermaids into space. Mermaids don't even exist.
You don't know that. Can't disprove a negative.
No, that's true. No, mermaids might exist, but unicorns definitely don't.
Ask Scotland, mate. McCabe.
They also think that the Loch Ness Monster exists. So there's a whole nother IdioFacto right there.
Those credulous Scots. So the object that's often quoted as the first mermaid object...
Carmen San Diego. Carmen San Diego.
I'm glad that you interrupted it with a song because I said mermaid again.
Carmen San Diego. Did you? What are you trying to say when you say mermaid?
Man-made.
Man-made. Right.
So the
So the mermaid sits in the capsule and gets blasted out into space, is that right?
Got to be filled with water though.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously. They got gills.
Obviously.